Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to World Childless Week 2024 and this webinar, Constructing Worthiness and Intimate Conversation. I'm Sarah Roberts from the Empty Cradle, and I'm here with Gayle Letherby, visiting professor at Plymouth, Greenwich and Bath Universities. Hey, Gayle.
Hi, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here.
Yeah. At the beginning of gatherings in Australia, we offer an acknowledgement of the lands where we live, work, and gather, and I'd like to do this now. In the spirit of reconciliation, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and specifically the Yagara and Turrbal people of the Brisbane region. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. We recognise their valuable contribution to Australian and global society. We'd also like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the lands where you live and work. So I just wanted to do a quick introduction to us both. I'm Sarah. I'm a childless-not-by-choice woman, a lived experience advocate and counsellor, and founder of the Empty Cradle, a service based in Australia for women transitioning to permanent involuntary childlessness. I'm honoured to be a World Childless Week ambassador and a Gateway Women Reignite facilitator. Gayle.
Hi, I'm Gayle Letherby. I too am a childless and not by choice woman, but I think it's fair to say that over the last 40 years of thinking and researching and writing about this issue, that our self-definitions, our feelings of identity and status shift and change, and maybe shift and change again across our lives, but probably more of that later.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because there can be the difference between identity and experience, and you're right that it can be really complex, can't it? That as that shifts and changes and we change. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to exploring that a little bit more in the webinar, which would be lovely. So just as an introduction to this webinar, I just wanted to do a general overview to do a little introduction, which locates Gayle's work, if you're not familiar with Gayle's work. So the idea for this webinar came from last year's 2023 World Childlessness Week webinar, Reclaiming Our Lives, the Need for Involuntary Childless Researchers. Gayle, when your name was mentioned, there was a knowing look between all of us on that webinar, and you were described as the matriarch of involuntary childless research. In my own potted way, I wanted to locate your scholarly work and its impact within an historical context. Gayle is one of the earliest childless not by choice feminist sociology scholars. Your work was literally one of the first entries into my EndNote database. So I am having a bit of a fangirl moment. In the 1970s, feminist scholarship into motherhood and child-free by choice women was begun with foundational work by Adrienne Rich, Ellen Peck, Judith Senderowitz, and others. Concepts around pronatalism and patriarchal motherhood emerged during this time. The experience of desiring motherhood and it not happening, and our lived experience voices of involuntary childlessness were basically absent, and we were mainly considered a medical problem to be solved. Gayle, your first work on involuntary childlessness, I think, was published around 1994, about 30 years ago. I'm sure you'll let us know. And congratulations, 30 years is extraordinary. And you were a pioneering lived experience, childless not by choice scholar. You were one of the first to articulate the continuum of childless and child-free. You named the caricatures used to describe us, for example, bereft, desperate, selfish, pitiable. And you also worked with the language that in some ways infantilized us as failing to mature as fully realized adults. And that's just the beginning of your work. Your scholarship has been cited in over 7,000 academic publications, including in the work of current CNBC scholars, including Robin Hadley and Christina Archetti. And I cannot overstate the importance of your work. So let me just start by saying thank you. Thank you. I feel a bit teary saying this. Not just from myself, but from all of us who have tended to broken dreams of never meeting our children, who have carried the grief, isolation, and social stigma of being childless not by choice, and who are exploring the possibilities for life now. Thank you for being a pioneering voice, for breaking the silence, the shame, and thank you for being a wise role model to us. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I seriously have something in my eye now.
Ooh. Yeah. It's so precious to have this conversation with you. So despite having many questions, I've managed to narrow it down to just a few. And as this is like a community conversation, I'd really like to invite the webinar participants that if you have any questions for Gayle or myself, please do bring them forward using the Q&A function. So Gayle, I wondered if we could begin right perhaps at the beginning, when your work as a feminist scholar in the 1990s, when scholarship was pretty thin on the ground, if any at all. And yet the scholarship around motherhood and being child-free was already fairly well established. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that time was like and a little bit about your journey, both personally and professionally.
Well, I actually came to higher education late, so I was 28, and my first career was as a nursery nurse, and I chose that because I thought of it as good preparation for all of the children that I was going to have. That was, that was how I envisaged it. And after taking quite a long time to get pregnant, I miscarried my one and only pregnancy, as far as I know, at 16 weeks, and felt that I just couldn't work in that area anymore. And kind of by accident, I found a sociology A level at a local FE college, and then again, kind of by accident, that led to me doing a degree. And my undergraduate dissertation was on women's experience of miscarriage, which again at that time there was really not that much looking at what we might call the social experience of that loss. And then when I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to do a PhD, I just decided I wanted to extend my, let's call it, autobiographical research agenda to look more at the experience of women who wanted to be mothers but were unable to. And I was also struck by everything that I was reading that kind of assumed that there was always a resolution to someone's childlessness. So they would either become mothers and fathers, we're talking about men too, either medically with assistance or not, or socially, or they would resolve the situation and it would kind of be over, as it were. And I just thought that this was far too simplistic, and that the whole experience was completely misunderstood and misrepresented. And as you said, Sarah, it was for people who were childless not by choice, then it was a pitiable situation, and the person would always feel desperate, always feel inevitably sad and shameful and less worthy than others, etc., etc. And this all just felt far too simplistic to me. And I really wanted to reflect on what it might be like, and to find out about what it might be like for women across the life course. So then I was kind of 30 when I started my PhD, and I was able to talk to women from their late 20s to their late 70s. it was really interesting to discover, as I said a bit earlier in the introduction, that things do shift and change, and things are different, and this experience is very different for different people, and
Yeah.
people define themselves in relation to others differently, and that we're not this homogenous group that even today we're sometimes seen as either, as we've said, pitiable and desperate if we're childless not by choice, and selfish and self-promoting if we're childless by choice. So I just felt like I really wanted to kind of I felt that that was really not the case, and I really wanted to talk to other people and communicate with other people to find out if I was right. And what was very interesting about my data collection was that I planned that I would interview people, and that I would, visit people in their homes and interview them. And I did do that. And I interviewed, I think it was 25, 26 women, and although I was expecting just to talk to women, sometimes the women I went to visit said, "My partner's here too. He wants to sit in. Is that okay?" So sometimes there were two people. I had a few men who contacted me too and said they wanted to be interviewed, and I didn't say no to anybody. So I interviewed 20, 25, 26 women and about 8 men over periods of time. So 3, 4, and 5 times for some people. But what was really unexpected for me was that um, several people wrote to me and said that they really wanted to be involved in the research, but they didn't want to talk about it because it just felt too raw or too difficult to talk about, or it was something that they'd never talked to anybody else about. And did I have a questionnaire? And I said, no, I haven't got a questionnaire, but these are the kind of things that I'm interested in. So I then corresponded with another 50 odd women, who some of them just wrote me one letter, and some of whom I corresponded with over a few months. Remember, we didn't have email, and we didn't use email in the same way, and we didn't use our phones in the same way then. So I actually had correspondence by letter from. So all in all, I was able to work with the experience of 80 plus people, which felt like a huge privilege, and still feels like a huge privilege. I can't get over the fact that I've been able to spend so much time thinking and writing about an issue that is so important to so many of us, but that
Yeah.
most people don't have the opportunity to do that really. So it's really kind of you to say all the things that you said about me, but it feels like a privilege. It just feels like a privilege to have been able to do it.
Gosh, I can relate to that. I can really relate to that in the sense that I'm wondering, and I'd love to hear perhaps how that was for you, where out of a lived experience, I imagine that you maybe came to the research with really particular burning questions. Um, and I guess I'm also curious about, was there something about that you had a lived experience that informed the research, and maybe what that might have been like, I guess, in terms of the research process? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I was really interested in self-definition. So I wanted people to come forward who self-define. So in my PhD, it was a focus on infertility and involuntary childlessness. And most of the things that I was reading was about women's experience of infertility. So there was research at that time, but it was about infertility or couples' experience of infertility. And I wanted my project to be much broader than that. So I had not, it wasn't completely all my choice, but I didn't go down the medical route to explore. It was in the context of the relationship I was in. It wasn't appropriate, so it wasn't an option. So I wanted to have a kind of holistic view in terms of people to be able to self-define themselves. And so what was very interesting was that some of the people who came forward who defined themselves in a particular way, I mightn't have defined them that way, and I didn't define them that way. And that was quite interesting. So to actually say, well, can you tell me a bit more about what that means for you, and what that label means for you, or what that definition means for you, and whether that's changed or not. So that was really interesting. In terms of my own autobiographical connection, I was very lucky that as a sociologist, and at that time there was a new group called the auto / biography study group, which was a focus on the relationship between self and other, and the fact that when we write and talk about ourselves, other people are involved in some way, people who've socialized us, people who we engage with, people we're close to. But when we write and research and talk about others, ourselves are always involved in some way, and that we bring something to the research that we do. So I was in that research community, that kind of methodological community, which gave me the support to do research where I was very much a part of the data that I was collecting. So although I advertised in various places, I advertised in newspapers, local ones, and a couple of national ones. I advertised in universities in the area where I lived. I advertised in some doctor's surgeries, and I never named my identity, as it were, in the adverts. But everybody asked me why I was interested in the topic. Everybody, and I told them. So I told people, why I was interested in a little bit about our own history. Interestingly, for some people, that was enough. That was all they needed to know, because that was a kind of connection to me. Other people asked me throughout the research process what it was like for me, and what I'd done, and what choices I'd made, and what did I think about, and that kind of thing. And at times that was a bit challenging. And, at times, mostly it was fine, but at times it was a bit challenging, because sometimes people I was talking to had made a different choice or had a different view about something that I had. And I wanted to be honest, but at the same time, I didn't want to distress anyone. So sometimes that was sort of difficult thing to kind of deal with. And there was a couple of funny instances where I remember one couple that I visited, and 5 times, and they fed me every time I went. I don't drive. They picked me up from the station, they took me back to the station. We had a lovely evening, but every time, sometime in the evening, they would start to argue with each other, not very aggressively, but argue with each other about some of the decisions that they were making. And then they both looked to me to kind of confirm each of their positions, which is really hard. And the most funniest occasion was when the guy said to me, "Well, you're just as bad as she is." So it was quite interesting that I
knew you'd take a sign.
I did become part of the community that I was researching. But emotionally, I have to say something about the emotion of it all, because now anybody on this in this webinar who works in the university will know the ethics process that we go through now is kind of super careful in terms of both protection of respondents, but also protection of researchers. There really wasn't anything. There wasn't anything when I was doing my research. There was no such thing as an ethics committee. So it was my supervisors basically that kind of supported me, but really only kind of supported me. And I think it was, for them, it was difficult because I was doing something a bit different and that was very emotionally engaging. And although I said, I got all this data and I'm very privileged to have it, I got too much. I did too much data collection and had all of these stories that I didn't quite know what to do with. And although I've said that, I don't know if you can hear this terrible thunder and lightning where I am.
Is it?
The gods are speaking to
the
us.
gods. We told
And
you you had too much data.
exactly that. Worthiness, what do you mean worthiness? Uh, so uh, although I was very it was very interesting in terms of the way it began to make me feel. So although I said I was very honest and open, sort of I did about 18 months of data collection, and about a year in, I didn't know what I felt about anything anymore. And
Wow.
when people said to me, "What do you feel?" I'd say, I don't know. Seriously, I don't know. I've heard so many stories, and there's so much emotion in those stories that I don't know where I am in relation to this at the moment. And I had to take a break. I had to take a break from it. And I can't not talk about this issue without talking about my own mother, who just supported me through everything. I've had quite a lot of loss throughout my life, and my mother was the one who supported me through it all until her own death in 2012. And I've written about this since. I didn't realize until after she died that she never ever talked about my childlessness in how it impacted on her, the loss for her. I'm an only child. So, no babies for me, no grandbabies from my mum. She never talked about that. It was always about me. And I seriously think without my mum, I just wouldn't have got through my own journey, but I wouldn't have got through my PhD either. My mum was the main supervisor, really, because I just wouldn't have been able to do it without her.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And in terms of this kind of work, I think we can't think enough about the the impact that it might have on us. And now looking back again, as I've said, I'm I'm so glad that I've done it. I'm so glad that I'm still being able to do it. And doing the research has and reflecting on the research and other people's research and being part of the community has enriched my life beyond, I can't describe how much. But it hasn't always been easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, that was a
Wow.
very long answer.
Yeah. It was such a beautiful answer. And so I almost got this sense that you were working with this pioneering topic working with the research methodology that at that time sounded pioneering as well in terms of autoethnography. Um, and yet at the same with time within that context, like really precious stories that you were hearing, but also that you were in a context as well where you were being held and supported. And it sounds like your mum's fingerprints were within that work as well. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's so
Yeah,
lovely to hear.
I asked her to read my thesis. I asked her to read my thesis, and my mum was one of the wisest person I've ever met. Really, very funny, very clever, very astute. But she left school at 14, and she was very unsure about her academic capabilities. So I gave her my PhD to read, and she read it, and she said, "There's only one word I don't understand, Gayle." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Epistemology. What does epistemology mean?" So I was very chuffed that it was. I've got a big thing about academic work being accessible, and I think often it isn't. And if we don't produce work that is useful beyond the academy, then I don't really think it's worth us doing it. So
Mm,
particularly on experiences that are about people's lives.
yeah,
Why would we not want anyone and everybody to be
yeah,
part of the
yeah.
discussion of those?
Absolutely, absolutely, and particularly when I mean, obviously there's so much more public education and public voices now, but the experience itself grief itself can be quite a isolating experience. Then the stigma of being childless, and so having access to, I know for myself, you know, when I first, so it was 2000, end of 2015 that my childlessness landed, and I was really, it was like I was so unaware of just how invisible the experience was. It hadn't even occurred to me of
mm,
necessarily being
mm,
an experience. Um, and was just responded to in such a way that didn't it just wasn't held and seen, and within me I initially went, is it about me, is there something wrong with me that the grief is so profound and I'm
yeah,
struggling to work this out. um so so that was then really when I started looking at the research and what has been read about, what has been written about this and what has been thought about, and had lots and lots of burning questions, I guess, around um, the experience itself, and what was there perhaps within the academy that hadn't been accessible or hadn't been obvious within the community. And so I guess I wondered for you in your research, were there barriers to people coming forward and connecting with you, the research participants? Was there a sense of isolation, and was it hard to reach out and find research participants? Or
mm,
yeah,
mm.
how was that process?
I mean, I can't know. I always think it's interesting. You can't know why people didn't come forward because, of course, there were
Yes, of
people who
course.
did come forward, and I can't know why. I had a couple of interesting experiences with local newspapers. So I uh, I approached local newspapers, and mostly they just reproduced what I wanted them to reproduce. But a couple of the local newspapers insisted on interviewing me, which was fine. And then again, what they wrote about what I wanted to do was fine, but sometimes the headings were a bit sensational. So, for example, in Stoke-on-Trent, which is where I was doing some of my research, the local newspaper is called the Sentinel, and there is a women's section called the Sentinel. And so my advert, a little interview with me, was reproduced in the Sentinel, and the wording of what I'd said seemed to like fine to me, but the heading was learning from the pain and suffering of involuntary childlessness, which I was just kind of horrified by because yet again it just kind of stereotyped the experience as just one aspect of the
Yeah,
experience. No acknowledgement of the continuum that we might move on across our life course, no acknowledgement of the fact that at times we might feel ambivalent about our status and that we
yeah,
might shift and change. So I was just kind of really distressed by that. But I think about 6 or 7 women came forward because of that. And I asked them all what they thought about the heading. And they all said, oh, it doesn't matter, Gayle. The wording of the piece was what brought me forward. And I just really wanted to tell you my story. And so that's okay. But I can't know who put off, can't know
yeah,
who kind of didn't come forward. So I suppose, as we still have this problem now, whereas that there is that, the simplistic definitions get in the way of kind of
yeah,
broader understanding, don't they?
yeah,
So, but
yeah,
I didn't, as I said, I didn't have any problem getting people to speak to me. And I think because it highlights to what you've just said, Sarah, certainly at that time when there wasn't social media and there wasn't the groups that we've got now, there wasn't World Childless Week and there wasn't other groups that are working on this and talking about this very publicly. Lots of people were essentially very much in isolation, very
yeah,
much in isolation. And interestingly, I found that in my miscarriage research too. So in the miscarriage research that I did, it wasn't until years after my miscarriage that I learned that there was a thing called the Miscarriage Association. Nobody told me, nobody told me at the doctors. They just said go home and try again.
yeah,
What they
yeah,
said. Relax and it will all be fine.
yes.
And,
All those tropes.
that. So I think that I mean, I'm not saying now that people don't feel isolated because I think often people do, but at that time it was so difficult to find someone. And
Mm.
the thing is, some of the people that I spoke to had gone on to have children. So either with medical help or after kind of years of trying, they managed to conceive without any medical intervention. Some were social parents, either through adoption or step relationships. So I spoke to people who had children in their lives now, and people who didn't, and some. I mean, and that was really interesting because I can remember two respondents who were kind of similar, in that they'd both gone on to conceive after several years of trying, and one of them spoke to me about how it is eventually it had impacted on her relationship, and their relationship had broken down. And she spoke about how her childlessness when she was awful, really awful, but the most awful thing in her life was the fact that she lost this relationship that was so important to her. And then the other woman that I was talking to actually had been struggling with cancer for the last sort of 5 years, and in remission and then back and then in remission and back. And she had a couple of children after several years of trying. And she said to me that the childlessness was the worst thing in her life, the absolute worst thing in her life. So, it's different for different people. And
Different for
I
different people,
just
isn't it?
think we need
Yeah.
to acknowledge that, really, and that it's
And
never simplistic.
yeah. Yeah. And I think within that, that if it is a if it is a grief that's really intense, and it's a grief for a current loss of children, and it's a loss for a hoped for future. I think what you're almost saying within there is around respecting that diversity, and in a way respecting that people do have very different responses.
Mhm.
Because sometimes women that I work with can feel this sense of shame around, shouldn't I be over this? Or why am I, why is it still quite tender for me, often years later? Um, yeah, and others who butt up against, I'm actually in some ways, so I have had some women who've reached out to me who felt like, shouldn't I have cared about this more? I'm
Yeah,
actually kind of either relieved or ready to move on to the next, what life looks like for me now. And you're right, is that we can carry these. And I guess I was wondering, how does sociology and perhaps a gendered lens really help us to understand the cultural context and the stories that we tell ourselves. So one of the things, for example, in my work that I often see is what I kind of almost call the hurdle race of conception, where right down the end here you'll have women who or people who may not have had an opportunity to try for children, through to we tried, maybe there were embryos, maybe there was a miscarriage, there might have been stillbirth, a living child, or perhaps a child who dies. And there's along that continuum, there can be such a comparison that happens, which is, oh, somehow I didn't do enough, or my grief isn't worthy, or my loss perhaps isn't considered socially worthy enough. Um, and yeah, I'm just wondering, how does a sociological frame help us to understand not just that around grief, but more broadly around the scripts and that might impact on how we understand our experience, I guess.
Mhm. Well,
Yeah.
I suppose one of the things I say to new sociology students is that what sociology, I mean, a good sociologist is somebody who's nosy, wants to know what's kind of going on in other people's lives. But, the thing that sociology most helpfully encourages us to do is to challenge what everybody knows, about an experience. And I think that what what I hopefully did, and what I know lots of other really great researchers are doing at the moment. But what we obviously continue, we need to continue to do is to challenge what everybody knows about people who don't have children, because still everybody thinks that they know what it's like for people who don't have children. So, if we just think, for example, about what's happening in the news at the moment, in the American presidential race, and some of the comments that have been made around childlessness in relation to that, really. And this is kind of an aside, but I think it's relevant. A few years ago, I myself was quite active politically on Twitter, and I made a criticism of the then UK Prime Minister Theresa May, and somebody who follows me on Twitter said, "Well, what can you expect, Gayle? Barren cow that she is." So I responded by saying, "Well, I don't have any children.
Yeah.
Are you putting me in that same category then? Are you putting me in that same?" And he was completely apologetic and backed down. But the fact that he felt comfortable enough to say it, that the reason that someone was making ideological choices that we would disagree with was because she was, inverted commas, barren, because she didn't have any children. And I think what sociology helps us to do is to continually to challenge those kind of everyday stereotypes that people are still buying into, and we draw on concepts like emotional work and emotional labor and stigma and presentation of self and socialization and all of that. But basically, all of that does is just helps us to shine a light, I think, on the fact that what everybody knows isn't actually always the truth, or isn't actually always everybody's experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's what I've always thought as theory in terms of academic theory is something that should be useful, not something again that should be opaque. That's something
Yeah.
that just helps us to understand the situation more better, and as you say, to understand that continuum. Because also
Yes.
there was a researcher, James Monarch, who was researching childlessness a bit around the same time that I was, and he talked about continuum from involuntarily childless to voluntarily childless, and the way in which people move across that. And
Yeah.
again and again, I think it's interesting that in terms of a continuum, we can move along and then move back again. And what I
Interesting.
found really interesting is that, kind of gratifying, I suppose, is that some of the things I was arguing 30 years ago about actually what it might be like for older childless women, I'm kind of experiencing myself now. So,
Okay. Yeah.
okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. I was right. I was right. Is it because I would say now that my life is, well, it's joyful. I have a joyful life. I have interesting work. I live in a lovely place. I have lots of children and young people in my life. From my work. Obviously, I work with lots of people that are younger than me. I have lots of children and grandchildren of friends that are part of my life. Yet at the same time, almost every day, I'll see something on the news, or somebody will say something to me, throwaway, that makes me feel different and othered
Yeah.
and excluded.
Yeah.
So those two things
Can coexist.
can happen at the same time, can't they?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it's that thing, isn't it, where it's almost like heterosexism, where the assumption is everybody's straight, and then the other is the person who's LGBT. And so it almost works in a similar kind of way, where the assumption is that everybody is a parent, and then there's people who are different or who are othered, but they're not necessarily,
Mm.
and then kind of almost sound like they're kind of packaged up into a monolithic group. And what you're saying is actually within that group, there's a huge diversity, and even within our own stories and experiences. there's a lot of diversity and a lot of change over time. Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it's just, I think what I'm wondering about in your work is, does it feel like, I'm just wondering if there feels like there's some key messages and key observations that perhaps you were making 30 years ago that feel so relevant now, and similar kinds of things. Like, I don't know, like I heard some of that stuff around the childless cat ladies, and I just thought, this feels like somebody who's been moved from another time and place. This does not feel like somebody who is actually living in the modern world, and maybe who has relationships and connections with a
Yeah.
diversity of people who don't have children. I mean, not that I want to make assumptions about that, but it just felt like such a dissonance between, in a way, what you've described, which is your lived experience, and then those tropes and stereotypes and comments and all of that unconscious patterns that inform the responses to us, but aren't actually us and our story, I guess. Yeah,
Mm. I
yeah,
suppose um I feel mixed about this, constantly frustrated, but at the same time gratified. So I'll start with the positive. You know, as I said a little earlier, you know, the fact that there are so many more people now talking about childlessness, there are so many more people talking about um, what we've just called a continuum, diversity, you know, different
yeah,
experiences. There are so many opportunities now for people to feel kind of comfortable, as it were,
yeah,
to talk about their lives. But on the other hand, I feel so frustrated that I'm still arguing the same things I was arguing 30 years ago at some level, and some things have just not changed. You know, my Theresa May example, the United States example, and I know there's been a bit in the news about this recently, but I responded, or I wrote something recently in response to the "as a mother" phrase. And
yeah,
there's an advert, anyone in the UK will be aware of this, is an advert for one of the water aid charities that's on the TV at the moment, or it has been quite recently. And it's the ambassador is a celebrity and an actor. I can't remember her name. And she says, you know, as a mother, you know, I'm thinking, okay, so as a non-mother, I just want these children to not have anything to drink then, not have clean water. And
yes,
I'm finding it really interesting. Um, and I don't know whether this is the Zoom effect, but I'm finding it really interesting. I've been in several meetings recently where academics towards the end of their career, exactly, someone's just said as a human, um, to academics towards the end of their career are saying something like, of course, I'm not doing this for me anymore. I'm doing it for my children and my grandchildren. And I'm just thinking, how can you say that without thinking about the context of what you're saying? So, although I haven't publicly been brave enough to say this in a meeting yet, but I am going to say sometime, I'm doing this for everybody's children and grandchildren. You know, I'm doing
yes,
it for
yeah,
all of
yeah,
us. I'm doing
yeah,
it for all of us.
yeah.
You know?
I'm not just putting my publications on the family intranet. I'm actually
Yeah,
dispersing it into the population for all of us to
yeah.
benefit from it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So I think we've come a long way, but at the same time, I think, you know, the fact that we're still having to say some of the same things again and again and again, it's
yeah,
it's just frustrating. But you know, we my philosophy is don't ever give up, don't ever give up. Just
yeah,
keep
yeah,
showing and just keep telling and just keep sharing
yeah,
how it is a complex. You don't have to pity me, but I do want you to respect me. I guess
respect.
that's it.
That's the word, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
really significant. It's wherever I'm at in this story.
yeah,
Um, and it's that thing where, for me to build a sense of worthiness, I sometimes need to have some space between myself and the culture, and actually have enough space in my life to work out how actually is that from me? What are the messages I've absorbed from the culture that maybe I haven't had a
Mm.
chance to examine? And how do I build a sense of worthiness and respect for myself and my story? Um, yeah, there's a couple of, I'm just wondering if we could, a couple of questions in the chat that I wondered if we could turn to. One of them is around, so there's a couple that have come up around medical responses and where information wasn't given, and really what could be done in terms of educating service providers, I guess, and perhaps around resources and ensuring that the resources are made available. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I would be maybe thinking things like World Childless Week came from women, or came from women and men like ourselves who who walked forward and actually you know, raised our hands and did community education and advocacy, and perhaps if people are drawn to it, and perhaps in a better space, that they might be able to, you know, to get it out to medical associations and say, hey, this is really important, this information needs to be distributed. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've got any other thoughts around yeah, where to now, how we could really yeah, support better responses to our
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. I think it's across the board too. I mean, one of my earliest publications was entitled "I didn't think much of his bedside manner, but he was a very good doctor," and that was actually a quote from one of my respondents talking about an infertility consultant who you'd think would kind of understand and be empathetic,
Mm.
but was not. And I know medical education now, because I'm a little bit involved with this at Plymouth. Medical education now does include a little more emphasis on what we might call reflective practice to encourage junior doctors and training doctors to think about these things. But again, I just think there's so much more to be done across the board of kind of raising kind of awareness of your point earlier about the default position is that everybody is a parent. I'm being quite eclectic across my career, and I'm interested in quite a lot of different things. And something I'm working on at the moment is around sports development. I went to a conference recently with a colleague on sports development, and there was a paper on, and actually they just mentioned 2 or 3 papers about recognizing the reproductive body and being aware of the significance of the reproductive body in terms of sports and how it might impact on women. So they mentioned menopause, they mentioned menstruation, and they mentioned pregnancy. Nobody mentioned loss, pregnancy loss. Nobody mentioned infertility. Nobody, So it's like if we think about women and we think about reproduction, we think about those 3 things. We think about menstruation, we think about menopause, and we think about pregnancy and birth. Still, so I just think there's still so much more to be done, not just, yes, in the medical arena, and not just within the let's call it obstetrics and gynecology, but more broadly. But also, I remember just recently I went to the GP, and they were testing my feet for pulses, and the nurse put the sort of machine on my foot and said, it's just like an ultrasound for when you were pregnant.
Yeah.
So
When you're
again, the assumption
with
is
everyone who was pregnant.
always.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So sorry, that
And
isn't really a solution. It's just that
yes.
it's still something that needs to
Yeah.
be very high
Yeah.
on our agenda.
And there's something of framing there, isn't there, within that context, which is almost around, we engage with you as a potential mother, or as a mother. And then even, for example, when like it's fairly routine, for example, within medical situations to be asked, do you have kids? And that's almost treated like a fact. It's like, oh, tick the box, keep moving. It doesn't even land within perhaps the consciousness of the provider that there might actually be a lived experience that sits
Mm.
behind that, which,
Mhm.
as you said, is incredibly varied, falls or could move across that continuum. And it's really about starting to recognize and get some of that research and get some of that information,
I think
shifting.
another thing to do is to think also about, sorry, interrupted you, Sarah, but
No, no,
I
no.
think another thing is to think about the ways in which we tell our stories. And
Yeah.
research is super important. Of course it is. I've been doing research for all these years and I wouldn't argue that it wasn't. And social science research is really important because it's around people's lived experience. But one of the things I've got really interested in the last 15 years or so is how we might tell academic stories differently.
Yeah.
So I've started to write what I call sociologically informed fiction and memoir, and to
Oh, wow.
publish that more broadly and
Yeah.
than within academic journals. And certainly, um, I find it really, another thing I find quite distressing is that quite often, if you watch a film or a play or you read a book, um, the childless women are often villains. So,
Yes.
so the woman who wanted to be a mother and couldn't be a mother is the woman
Yes.
who is dangerous, stealing other
Yes.
people's children,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
even a murderer, or
Yeah.
and that comes again and again and again and again in there. So,
Yes.
and if you think about the televisation of The Handmaid's Tale, for example, where the non-mothers are seen as the real villains, even more so than the patriarchal society that they're living in, really.
Yeah.
So that the I just think that happens again and again and again. So
Yeah.
I actually devour anything that I find that is a more holistic,
Yeah.
fictional representation of the experience, and I think that's one way in which we can, I don't know, raise consciousness, I suppose we might call it, if there are more stories that people
Yeah.
connect with, and poetry and art and music that actually connects to the diversity of our experience. That can only help, I think, because I
Yes.
still think there's a long way to go to challenge
Yeah.
this dominant expectation that like I'll sometimes watch. There was something on last year. I can't remember what it was called. And it was a really good series, and I really enjoyed it. And then there was the central character was a woman with three children, and then at the very end of the last episode, you found that she'd she was a social worker, and she'd essentially stolen the children and brought the children up, inverted commas, as her own. So this woman who was supposedly this, presented as a kind of Mother Earth figure, was then damned as someone who'd stolen somebody else's children. It just
Yes.
happens so often,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's seen as kind of good TV. I just think
Yes.
that's another way in which we could keep
Yeah.
challenging by
Extreme.
telling stories that
Yeah.
show diversity of experience.
And one of the things I think that's been so wonderful about the World Childless platform is there are so many resources there, including things like the NOMO Book Club, just so many. So the
Mm-hmm.
NOMO Book Club is a place where it's curated, where books of positive role models about women without children
Yeah.
are reviewed and brought to our attention. So you're right, it's. I have to say personally, I did not know anybody in my personal world who had desired motherhood and it didn't happen and who actually ever talked about it. And so I had no role models for, first of all, how do you grieve this? Um, that it's actually possible to grieve this, and that part of our capability as humans is the capacity to digest this experience. And then also reimagine ourselves. And the part of the grief experience is to reimagine ourselves and to reimagine our lives, perhaps, and then find opportunities to go, well, what is a meaningful and perhaps generative way that I can live in a way that's meaningful? And I guess I was curious from your experience and research. What are some ways or stories that you saw um, people doing that, I guess, in their lives? Yeah, like were there stories of yeah, just ways that people were almost like you touched on earlier around aging, where actually once you got there, that the experience was actually quite different from how you'd imagined it, perhaps at midlife. Yeah. So
So, role models? Is that?
yeah, or even just stories that really went against the cultural norms. So Christina Arquetti in Norway has done some wonderful work doing film analysis and looking at the culture and looking at the ways that childless people are represented. And I'm just curious, I think in your research, it sounded like a lot of the lived experience and stories actually really challenged those tropes, like those
Yeah,
expectations.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
They did, and I mean, just two things. One, I had a really interesting experience in my Viber where I refused to present my data as in terms of a life course, you know, so in terms of this is when I first thought that I might have children. This is what happens as I was trying, and then this is where I am now. I refused to kind of do that, and I was more focusing on themes in which I drew across women across the life course. And there was a 3/4 of an hour discussion in the Bible about why did I not present it in terms of a life course perspective, and I said that I didn't want to do that because basically that assumes an end point and a resolution, and that I was pretty sure then, which I agree with, as I said now, that that didn't happen for most people. So, as I said, it went on and on and on. And they were saying, you know, well, it would have doing more, you know, that's what the sociological way kind of thing. So, in the end, I got a bit fed up and I said, so would it have been better if I'd done it that way then? And my external examiner said, no, Gail, it just would have been different. So, that was okay. They kind of got it. They kind of got it. And while I was doing my PhD, I was actually reading a novel at the time, and it was called Daughters of Jerusalem. And I can't remember the author, Daughters of Jerusalem. And it was set in the 1970s, and it was about a woman who was in a feminist consciousness raising group, and her feminist consciousness raising group was focusing a lot on political activity, but a lot on the importance of recognizing motherhood as a key identity for women, and the fact that, you know, women are different because they're mothers essentially. And the key character in the book is childless not by choice and trying to become pregnant. And so the challenge for her throughout the book is very kind of true to life, really. And
Mm.
and all the way through the book, I was thinking, I hope I'm not going to be disappointed by the ending. I hope I'm not going to be disappointed by the ending. And the ending essentially is you don't know what happens to her next. You don't know if she gets pregnant. You don't know if she carries on. And that just
Yeah.
felt like a perfect ending. It
Yeah.
just felt like a perfect ending because there wasn't this, oh, and she's having a baby now and everything's
Yes.
fine, you know,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
and she's completely resolved her.
Yes.
It recognized the kind of both it demonstrated ambivalence throughout, but it also recognised the kind of the uncertainty and
Mm.
the and the kind of the way in which women and men adapt and readapt and then adapt again and readapt again to different things that are going on in terms of their life course. So that's stayed. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author, but that stayed with me as a really positive.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, lots of things in life we don't know what's going to happen next, do we? Or we
Absolutely.
don't know how we're going to feel about that
Yeah.
next, or we don't know how we're going to feel in that particular
Yes.
situation. And I suppose in terms of um, thinking about other role models, I would say the people that I've spoken to, across my career, um, about this kind of issue, who've shared their stories with me, because now people share their stories with me because they know what I'm interested in. And I think, again, if we accept that, I don't even have to agree with their particular view on this issue or that issue, and I
Mm.
don't have to share their experience, and it's all right for me or they to have made different choices, but the fact
Yeah,
that there are all those people who've been, willing to share stories with me. People
yeah,
do it now.
mm,
Students, colleagues,
yeah,
um, friends of friends share
mm,
their story with me, and
mm,
people often say, I've never told anybody this.
yeah. It's amazing, isn't it, how often that happens? That we carry these incredible stories that are they're often left not told, that are held and kept to ourselves, and offering that precious gift of listening and
That must happen
validation.
to you all the time. That must happen.
Such a powerful, yes, it's such a blessing in the work. And I guess what I'm imagining as you were talking, it's almost like within the experience, there's two really key parts. There's the this didn't happen, the adjustment process, the grief, the holding of that, and the processing of that. And then it's almost like the reimagining of self, the reimagining of our place in the world. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about your work and what you've touched on here is that for many of us, well, all of us were at some point children. All of us have had relationships with people who are parenting. And it's very easy for us to imagine ourselves into a life as a parent and to have a really like a literacy around what are the different components of what a life as a parent might look like. And I think what you're almost touching on is we almost need the imagination and the opportunity to see what does a life of a non-parent, what are the possibilities within that life, and how do we imagine ourselves into that life and hold a sense of possibility and yeah, yeah, it
Mm.
feels like that's been a really important part of your work is to bring forward those beautiful stories. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
and I'm thinking about, okay, the theme, thinking about worthiness is, I do feel worthy. I am worthy. I am a worthy person,
yeah,
and I we all are. And I think that doesn't mean to say that you don't feel uncertain sometimes, and
yeah,
we don't we don't feel um, continuing grief, or
yeah,
that might be different at different times in our lives, or a loss, or I don't like the word regret. I've decided that I haven't really got any regrets, because um, everything I've done, I've learned something from. So
yeah,
it isn't
yeah,
about regret. There's things I miss, and
yeah,
there's things I wish I had, and there's things I wish I still had that I once had. But I do feel I've had something to offer the world, and I've done it, and people have responded, both in my personal life and my private life. And actually, if we sit down and count those things, we could all count lots of things, couldn't we? But
yeah,
again, if we're thinking about this through a sociological lens, there is a stereotypical hierarchy of worthiness, isn't there? So,
yeah,
and again, that's something that we need to challenge,
really.
in terms of, oh, my worthiness is better than your worthiness. We need to
Yes,
change that in terms
yeah,
of in terms of
Yeah.
the expectations of us, and when we
Yeah.
don't fulfill those expectations but do other things.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
that
I'm
if we're
back to,
reaching into that, sorry,
well, no, so it's okay. Go on, you go on.
I was just thinking that if we're reaching into that cultural space to find our sense of worthiness, to understand that if that's a culture that doesn't actually hold our stories and our value, that for me it really emphasizes the need to connect with other people who've got similar lived experiences, to really have a look at that internal landscape. Yeah, and to really to nurture that, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm so grateful for your work, and so thankful that you've shone a light on this experience for such a long time for us. And yeah, just so thankful. Yeah. So I'm just conscious that we've come up to the hour, and yeah, if there's anything you might like to say in closing, Gail, and yeah, thank you.
I just want to say thank you, really, and thank you for all the kind thoughts, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's uh, you know, as we're all saying across this week, we need to keep talking, we need to keep sharing, and I'm honoured to be part of that.
Yeah. And we want to say thank you to all the wonderful people that have participated, the
I haven't had a chance to look
insights,
at much of the
the
chat, but
conversation in the
thank you,
chat, the
everybody.
questions you've brought forward, and just thank you to Steph and for the hosting of World Childless Week. So thank you.